still bring forth fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green. From Psalm 92. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Curiously, from Immanuel Kant's Critique of Practical Reason. So, welcome back, friends, and here we are on Letter 17, the star of Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. And what a light-filled letter it is. You notice that these last letters, almost the last half of the sequence of the tarot, really goes between light and dark, or maybe the way of grace and the way of the serpent, but which is present through all the letters in some degree. But it's certainly really palpable in these last letters. I mean, you go from death to temperance to the devil. Right? Then we have the Tower of Destruction. But after that, the star, which is light, the moon, which is a little heavy, the sun, heavy, the sun's light, and then judgment is heavy, and then ending at the end of the sequence, the tarot with the world, even though Tomberg inserts the fool right in before the world. I will talk about that when we get there. But here's this fascinating letter filled with delight in a way. Because he's talking about, as we've talked in other ways already, about the universal sap of life, which he recognizes in this card, right? The agent of transformation from the ideal to the real. And this is when we talked earlier about Bios and Zoe. This is the Zoic presence in this letter. And also, as we get there, you'll see what I'm talking about. Here again, there's an implicit sophiology in this letter. And really, how could it not be? Tomberg is one of the Catholic fathers of sophiology. So let's talk. Now, again, he contrasts the electrical nature, the magical agent, right, of the magicians. The magical agent. They were all kind of hot to access. The serpent biting its tail. But there's something else going on, and he's talking, and he mentions this on page 465 about these two different agents. And here's what he says: the two agents manifest themselves everywhere, including the domain of human intellectuality. There are minds who have sided with water, and it is to them that we owe the ideas of transformism, evolution, progress, education, natural therapy, living tradition, and so forth. And there are others who have sided with fire, to whom we owe the ideas of creationism, creation ex nihilo, invention, election, surgery, prosthesis, revolution, etc. And again, in Tomberg, it doesn't necessarily say to do one rather than the other. And as he acknowledges more and more through, as we can see, that you can't escape the horizontal existence. And we wouldn't want to, right? And he talks a little bit about dualism in this letter in regard to that, and talks about the value of dualism. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there are two kinds of people: those who believe in dualism and those who don't. I'll let that soak. And so this is kind of his approach in this letter, is to try to find the value, or to not outright dismiss the way of creationism. And I don't mean creationism as in the dreadful Christian answer to evolution. But there's something more to it. And on Dualism Epoch, this is where he gets to it on page 470. And he talks about the great masters of dualism made appeal to the will to awaken it and rid it of the weight of somnolence. And his three masters of dualism are Zarathustra, Buddha, and Mani. Right? You know. And so, and there is value in those. If we've talked about in the things they taught, right? Because as Tomberg points, from the point of view of the present, dualism makes a lot of sense. It's when we take on a more eternal viewpoint that we can see that there's more to the picture than what meets the eye. And people talk in education, in even politics about rejection of binaries. Well, you can't. We use binaries all the time, right? Children use it. They come to an automatic. I mean, day, night, father, mother. You know what I mean? The world is structured in binaries, in these opposites, right? And this is why Tomberg emphasizes so much throughout this book the marriage of opposites, the conjunctio oppositorum. They need to be united. So it's like I said, it's an important thing. And what he sees in the card, the star, for him it signifies hope. Right? And he says on page 471, hope is not something subjective due to an optimistic or sanguine temperament, or to a desire for compensation in the sense of modern Freudian and Adlerian psychology. It is a light force which radiates objectively and which directs creative evolution towards the world's future. And of course, he points to two thinkers who are not Hermeticists, in the formal sense, who hold to this idea. And these two thinkers are Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Henri Bergson, who Bergson is where he gets the idea of creative elan. It's Bergson's thing. And interestingly, I think it's Bergson's sister was married to MacGregor Mathers, the occultist. So there's some trivia you may not know. You would probably never guess that by reading Bergson. But Bergson, in the creative elan, this is the way of the star. This is the way of this creative growth, right? That, like the tree, right? He used the example of the tree versus the tower. Like the tree builds up gradually, right, and unfolds, and whereas the tower is built up kind of mechanically. And we see the same thing in various streams of occultism, where there is a stream of occultism that wants to build, kind of Crowley, the Thelemites, right? They want to build a structure to investigate higher worlds, whereas the Christian mystic path and the Hermetic path wants to become open to grace, which is not a building, which is a growth process. And so he continues on page 472. So now the spiritual exercise of the 17th Arcanum is that of the endeavor to see together, to contemplate the essence of biological growth, the agent of growth, and the essence of spiritual growth, hope, in order to find, or rather refine, their analogy, their intrinsic kinship, and lastly, their fundamental identity. Right? For it is a matter of grasping the essence of the water, which flows both in the obscure process of growth, multiplication, and continuity in biological reproduction, and in the clarity of the serene heights of hope. It is a matter, therefore, of coming to an intuition of water, such as it is understood in Moses' account of the second day of creation, where God separated the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and of understanding that the light which flows above consciousness and the instinctive drive which flows beneath consciousness are fundamentally the same thing, separated in order to act according to two different modes, namely water, which is the principle of growth and evolution, both biological and spiritual. Thus, it is necessary to attain to an intuitive perception that is immediate and endowed with the certainty of obviousness, that the principle of fluid sap and the principle of hope are one and the same, namely the principle of water. Fluid sap is the bearer of the agent of growth, and so is hope. This is hope springs eternal, right? Isn't that what they say? Now, if we think about this a little bit, and you can feel it, I think, in these words here, you can feel the creative elan bubbling up even inside of your own soul. It's because we want to be hopeful. We want to trust, as Rudolf Steiner said in his beautiful mantra or prayer that he offered, trusting in the ever-present help of the spiritual worlds. Truly, nothing else will do if our courage is not to fail us, right? Great meditation on trusting. Now, so what does he connect this hope to? Which is an interesting move on page 473. He connects this hope to motherhood, both to biological motherhood, and we can also connect it to spiritual motherhood. Now, just think biological, and he doesn't talk about this directly in the letter, but biological motherhood. What is it? So as we know, I'm a farmer, and the biological imperative, it runs rampant on my farm, with pigs and goats and chickens, they seek to continue the species, unconsciously, not like human beings do, but or plants, right? There's an implicit motherhood, desire for parenthood, which we also have in the human species, right? But because we have egos, we can separate ourselves a little, or mostly, from the biological imperative that seeks to continue the race, right? That you see in animals when it's mating season. That's all there is to it, people, right? You have to protect them if you don't want them to mate. You have to imprison them practically, right? And then they'll find the way out anyway. I've seen goats jump over relatively tall fences when it's that time of the year. So, but there's also the spiritual motherhood, which is also this, reflects this biological imperative, I guess we could say, that contains hope for the future. And this is what when he was talking about dualism, that's, dualism works in the present, but you have to tie, if you tie hope to dualism, it broadens dualism, and you see dualism in perspective then, and you see the eternal viewpoint in a way. I mean, not God's viewpoint, but we can see the universal viewpoint a little bit more when we pull away from that. And I think when Tomberg brings up this idea of the water above the firmament and the water below the firmament, which he says, the light which flows above consciousness and the instinctive drive which flows beneath consciousness are fundamentally the same thing. There's also, I think, an echo resonance with what we said earlier in the series about the light of the first day of creation versus the light of the fourth day of creation. Even though the light of the first day is this more spiritual light, the fiat lux. The light of the fourth day, even though it's physical light, I mean, they're not unrelated to each other. You know, there's not I wouldn't even say a fallen aspect of light. There's just the light we behold with our eyes is an analog of the light of the first day. Just like the water that we see is an analog of the light spoken of in Genesis. Just like, you know, in a sense that bios, you know, or the life we see teeming around us is an analog of the Zoe, the life that informs them. I think that's one way to look at it. It's not the only way to look at it. But interesting, though, in this letter, he gets to the center of his imagination about the star on page 473. This is what he says. This is why the card of the 17th arcanum of the tarot represents the woman, the maternal principle. Between the constellation of hope above her and the flow of continuity of biological life beneath her. Because every mother professes a double faith. The faith of celestial hope that the future will be more glorious than the present, and the faith of terrestrial continuity that the flow of succeeding generations will go forward in the direction indicated by hope from above. Every mother knows, insofar as she is a mother, that underlying the flow of generations there is at work the primordial magical impulse of the effective cause, the alpha, of the world, and that to the final cause, the omega of the world, will not fail to direct it and to draw it towards itself. In other words, each mother professes, by the very fact that she is a mother, the divine origin of the world and the divine aim of the world. If this were not so, she would refuse to give birth. That is, to give birth to children who otherwise would be destined to be the victims of absurdity. Therefore, we could also name the 17th arcanum the arcanum of the mother, or the arcanum of Eve. Now, when he wrote this, probably 66, 65, abortion was not the cultural phenomenon it is now. But I think his words here, have something to say to that debate. Now, I'm not sure everybody in that debate would want to hear these words, for one thing. But I think, and I think as Hermeticists, part of Hermeticism, and part of Sophiology as well, is to see things as they are. The world, to connect to the real, I like to say, to what is real. And I'm a farmer, right? We've talked about this before. So the biological imperative, which is one aspect of what he's talking about with the mother, right? The need to procreate, the biological desire implanted in all of us, in species, in plants, to procreate, right? Which, in the human kingdom, we can control that much more than the animal kingdom can, right? We choose when to start a family. We don't wait till biological maturity says it's now. You think animals can choose? They can't decide to, put it off until they get their career going. Same with plants. As soon as they're sexually mature, that's the day it happens. Right? But what we, having egos, we see the plants are the etheric kingdom, the animals are the astral kingdom, and here we are with egos, where we have the choice. And with choice comes, the potential for sin. Animals don't sin. We have the potential for sin. And then and we talked about this, I can't remember which letter it was, but we talked a little bit, I think it was in Temperance, a little bit about the ancient mysteries, the mysteries of the mother. And he mentions the mysteries of Isis in particular, which we talked about in relationship to Apuleius's The Golden Ass, right? Now, it's worth considering this. He says, the ancients drew hope for life and for the death in the mysteries of the mother. Right? And then he, so this was happening at the time, even of early Christianity, and St. Paul in Acts, in Ephesus, right, is dealing with some of the mystery cults. But here's what he says, St. Paul, from Romans 8. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been suffering the pangs of childbirth until now. The whole of creation, and I mentioned this before as well, that Christ came certainly for the salvation of man, of human persons, but for the salvation of the life of earth, right? And this is what St. Paul is talking about there, which is very often overlooked by mainstream theology, I would say. And it continues talking about this idea of the mother in regard to evolution, right? On this page 474. For modern evolution is at root only the Renaissance and the scientific guise of the ancient mysteries of the mother, the mysteries of hope and of the pangs of childbirth. The mysteries of the Father contain the what, salvation through the Son, and the mysteries of the mother contain the how, biological and spiritual evolution. Now, this is sophiology, is what he's doing here, and we'll see. Actually, I don't want to give it all away right now, but this letter is so implicitly but heavily sophiological, and he's really setting up where his one of his more profound sophiological letters is letter 19 on the Son. When we get there, we'll talk more. But think about this. The mysteries of the Father contain the what? Salvation through the Son. And the mysteries of the Mother contain the how? Biological and spiritual evolution. And you can see both of those, biological and spiritual evolution, coming together in the birth of Jesus. Right? As he implied earlier in one of the letters, where we talked about the task of the Hebrew people was to create the body, the vessel for God, in which God could incarnate, right? So that's biological evolution, right? But spiritual evolution as well, meaning because of the incarnation, the possibilities of not just salvation, but kinship with God open to the human being, right? So that's from Father Teilhard's book, Writings in Times of War. It's pretty extraordinary work, and I also include it in my collection of sophiological writings, The Heavenly Country, if you're interested in looking at that. But to return to Brother Valentine, so this is where this letter is alive, and this beautiful, and it's an affirmation of evolution, and this is why it's always kind of absurd to me, in some Christian quarters, the complete hostility toward the theory of evolution. Not that I think the theory of evolution, as we get it served up to us, is correct, because it's missing, as we know, the spiritual component, which Father Teilhard just articulated. And it's not figured out, and it's also hostile. Some of its promulgators are hostile to a Christian interpretation of anything. That there's Zoe anywhere is kind of anathema in those circles. But it's not. But there's more to it than that. And I think Tomberg, I think when he encountered Father Teilhard, that he felt here was a kindred spirit. Here's a man after my own heart. And because as Tomberg says here, also on page 474, here evolution and salvation, the two truths of science and religion, are no longer contradictory. They bear together the message of hope. Right? And the theory of evolution as taught now, right, survival of the fittest, is not given. It's not a hope. I mean, it's hope for the wealthy, hope for the powerful. It's not a hope for everyone. But if you take it in Tomberg and Teilhard's way, now we have something to work with. We have something to work with there. And then, of course, you see, though, that what this depicts right here is Tomberg's, one of his central notions about Hermeticism, which is synthesis, right? And I think this is the most beautiful, perhaps, example of synthesis in the entire book. What he's talking about right here, it just makes so much sense, and it's because you can feel the creative elan welling up in your soul. Certainly, I can. I mean, I assume any sensitive listener will hear the same thing. And he even calls it the synthesis of the truths of salvation and evolution is in fact a rainbow in which the immortal essences of the endeavors of the past are resplendent, purified of the temporary and accidental which has enveloped them. Boom! Way to go, Valentin Tomberg. And this, I love where right in the same paragraph, he moves into a description of what alchemy is now. Let me read it to you. 475. Alchemy today celebrates its apotheosis in the splendor of the rainbow of the synthesis of salvation and evolution. Today, alchemy has come out of the somber alchemical kitchens where its adepts often lavished entire fortunes in the flower of their lives, in order to be installed in a laboratory more worthy of it, the vast extent of the universe. Now it is the world which has become the alchemical laboratory. And it literally says, today we are witnesses of the triumph of alchemy. Now for me, my own personal experience, this manifests in my work as a biodynamic farmer, which is, it's alchemy. If you know much about biodynamic farming, it's alchemy. But what it's doing, just like he describes here, it's the synthesis of the truths of salvation and evolution. Because I'm working with plants and animals and the soil and the cosmos, right? And because plants are evolving, animals are evolving. I as a farmer, kind of do guide their propagation, right? Control their fecundity, right? But also, as I mentioned before, there's an aspect of salvation, which, just working biodynamically is salvation already, because it's regenerative, it's saving, it's treating the land with reverence, but also, as I've mentioned, it's, as far as I'm concerned, participating in the resurrection. It's the resurrection business, because the forces that were imparted to the earth itself from Christ on the cross are part of the forces with which a farmer works. And if a farmer works with we could call them diabolical forces of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, how could you do that? And we know, and we see what it's done to the earth, and to farming, and to health, the health of people. Nevertheless, I don't want to get too lost in it, but unfortunately, I'm going to get lost again, because after his slight digression into alchemy, he gets into a discussion of the poet, or poetry, right? And because I actually had never, except for in here, he quotes from Victor Hugo's poem, The Function of the Poet. Every idea, human or divine, which is rooted in the past, has its foliage in the future, which encapsulates the Hermetic ideal of not getting rid of the past and working toward the future. So it's rooted in tradition, moving forward. And as Tomberg says right here, 476, one cannot pass by poetry if one attaches value to tradition. Now think, who reads poetry? Other poets. So poetry is in a kind of degraded state right now. Even though there's a lot of great poetry being written, culturally it's a wasteland. There's no, poets languish, in good poetry languishes. Not like in other ages, everybody read poetry. Now we I don't know what we do. We read the news. And so he discusses all these wonderful things about poetry, and of course points to St. John of the Cross. His writings are actually are commentaries on his own poetry. And of course he talks about the poetic character of Father Teilhard's work, which it's unmistakable. And I would also say, he doesn't mention it. Well, he mentions it many, many times, but he doesn't mention it here. But with Goethe, right? This literary giant who also brings his poetic genius to his investigations of science and metamorphosis, right? So important. And he says here, talking about Father Teilhard, a poetic impetus vibrates in the whole work of Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, of a kind that his critics, as I understood from a conversation with one of them, see in it a weakness that is reprehensible from a scientific, philosophical, and theological point of view. But they are mistaken. He's right, they are mistaken. Since poetry is elan, and elan gives wings to imagination, and without winged imagination, directed and controlled by the strict laws of intrinsic coherence and conformity to facts, no progress is possible. One should only be on guard that one is not carried away by the imagination, which seeks brilliance and not truth. Extraordinary. And of course he says, Hermeticism also cannot pass by poetry. And further, and it's important. I really think, that's why I wrote my book, The Submerged Reality, right? Sophiology and the Turn to a Poetic Metaphysics. Because I felt, that sophiology, and I think this is where Tomberg is going in this letter, sophiology is this move into the poetic, which is not just poetry, which is into a truer truth. You can put it that way, right? A transcendent truth. And as he says here, poetry is not simply a question of taste, but rather one of fertility or sterility, or sterility of the spirit. Without a poetic vein, there can be no access to the life of the Hermetic tradition. Right? And he goes further. He says, let us therefore love poetry and respect the poets, for it is not dukes, margraves, and counts who constitute the true nobility of mankind, but rather the poets. Now, you can't read that, or I can't read it anyway, without thinking of Percy Bysshe Shelley and his defense of poetry. And he says practically the same thing here. I'm sure someplace in the back of his mind, Tomberg has Shelley. And here's one of the things poetry says in the defense: a poet participates in the eternal, the infinite, and the one. People dismiss Shelley as an atheist. He's no atheist. He just confessed it right there. And famously, and this is the part I think that Tomberg's drawing on, and this is how he ends the defense of poetry, or how Shelley ends the defense of poetry. Poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they are, what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And Shelley too gets dismissed by critics by always a romantic flight of fancy. He's right. He's right. Of course, I'm saying this because I'm a poet, right? And people would dismiss me for saying that. Now, now I don't want to get into it too much, but right after this, Tom Berg talks about, well, how do you write real poetry, right? And this is, he says, it's necessary to be incarnated, that is, to have the pulsation of warm earthly blood in order to be able to create poetic works. And not only poetic works of subjective significance, cetrams, but also those of objective significance, mantrams. Now, I don't know if he must have read it, he read everything. Sri Aurobindo, this is the kind of idea he has. He's got a book, I think it's seen on my shelf. I can't remember the name of it, but it's about poetry. And he was educated in England, and he was kind of immersed in the Romantic poets and also some of the poets of the late 19th century. So he knew his English poetry, and he knew the English poetic tradition, and he loved it. And he talked about this, and coming from a Hindu background, he talked about the mantram. When the poet really accesses spiritual reality, the poetry goes from the words of the setram, or the kind of just personal effusion of insight, to the mantram, which discloses eternal truths. And I think people who write poetry or read poetry and get enthused by it, they've probably been struck by this at one time or another, and that's why they keep returning to it. That's why people return to the arts, to music, because they feel the experience of the mantram. Right? In music, for instance, one place I felt it very profoundly once was in a university performance of Vaughan Williams' "The Lark Ascending," and it was so packed in the auditorium that the children of mine that I brought, we had to sit on the steps, but the performance was so profoundly moving. Even you could feel the entire audience just so attentive to the soloist, the violin soloist, this young woman. We were so intent, and you felt the audience with her every step of the way. It was a profoundly spiritual experience for me. I was in tears most of the performance. But that's, I don't want to try to articulate what that inspired in me, but other than to say it was what Aurobindo and Tom Berg talk about when they say rising to the mantram. The spiritual reality is disclosed. That is above the poet, or above the performance, above the composer. And he calls mantram formulae of magical significance in the three worlds. They are born from the marriage of warmth and light, from earthly blood, the bearer of continuity, and from celestial blood, the bearer of hope. And I think that's what the arts at their best do for us, because the arts at their best arise to the mantram, right? Not just cleverness. I mean, as much as I love James Joyce, very rarely does he rise to the mantram. I think he does, though, in Molly Bloom's soliloquy, in parts, not the whole thing, in Ulysses. But most of Ulysses, it's Joyce showing off his intellectual fireworks, and same with Finnegan's Wake. But yet, he still can stumble upon the mantram, right? It's not something you can plan. It's something you can plan at all. And as Tom Berg says here, magical formulae are not invented. just as poetry is not invented, but they are born from blood and light. I think it's absolutely true. And then, and I don't want to belabor it because we've talked about it quite a bit already, he gets into a discussion of this letter and how this is a kind of spiral echo or repetition, not really repetition, but spiraling, revisiting of same themes that were discussed in The Empress and in Force. Now, if you remember, those are also places where we get to an implicit or even explicit sophiology. And this is extraordinarily important for this, because I think where he's going, well, he also talks about the three spirals of the three generations in Matthew's Gospel, right? Where in the genealogies. And I'm trying to let there's one part here to go. Yeah, here it's coming up. So I lost my place. Yeah, so I don't want to get into it too much. But I would remark though that I think it's hermetically a really nice idea when he talks on pages 486 and 87 about these. The spiral of Israel's 3 steps, each of 14 generations, and the 3 steps of spirituality, those of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which he sees in Egyptian Hermeticism, in Zarathustra, and in the Vedas. That in the general history of mankind, these constituted the preparation for the coming of Christ. Right? Aren't the 3 weeks of Advent an abridgment of this preparation through millennia? The 4th week being their summary, the work of John the Baptist. And I just wanted to mention that, and I think, well, yeah, that's a nice way to think about it. And I would suggest that through Advent, that might be a nice thing to meditate on through those 3 weeks. And then the 4th week, the pronouncements of John the Baptist, the birth of John the Baptist. But I just want to mention in Waldorf schools, they also do a very, very beautiful thing with Advent, where they celebrate the 4 weeks of Advent. We'll say the first week they celebrate the kingdom of the stones, the mineral kingdom. And the second week of Advent, they celebrate the plant kingdom. The 3rd week they celebrate the animal kingdom, and on the 4th week it's the human kingdom. So, if you have children, we do this at our house in the 4th week of Advent. The first week we'll place crystals or other kind of fossils or stones or the things the children pick around our Advent wreath. In the 2nd week, maybe a pine cone, a leaf or something, a flower. In the 3rd week, things from the animal kingdom. In the 4th week, as we anticipate the birth of the Christ child, we also have an empty manger that we put on in the middle of the Advent wreath, where on Christmas Eve, miraculously, the Christ child appears. So it might, there's just some more practical hermeticism to raise your children with a practical hermeticism that it's not doctrinaire. Okay, there we go. So, but also, to finish, I think this is where he gets almost explicitly sophiological in the last page of the letter. And here's he says on page 490. The theme of the agent of growth has already been treated in these letters, notably in the letter on the 3rd arcanum, Empress, and on the 11th arcanum of the tarot, right? Get it? Those were the other sophiological letters. We cannot avoid the law of the spiral, which rules not only the totality of the series of major arcana of the tarot, but also the endeavors and the progress and consciousness of he who meditates on them. We have had to return to this theme for a 3rd time in the present letter, which thus represents the 3rd step of the spiral, to continue to infinity, concerning the theme of growth and evolution. Okay, first things first, so that's good, right? He's telling his method. But then he goes a little further. When he talks about the importance of the Emerald Table. And here's what he says, middle of almost the last paragraph. Thus, just as the Emerald Table saved the essence of ancient wisdom, and just as the tarot saved the essence of medieval wisdom, across the deluges which occurred in the time that separates us from them, may the essence of modern wisdom be saved in a spiritual Noah's Ark from the deluge which is going to come, and may it thereby be transmitted to the future, just as the essence of ancient wisdom and that of medieval wisdom has been transmitted to us by the means of the Emerald Table and the major arcana of the tarot. The tradition of Hermeticism blossomed in the past and must live in the future. This is why a new modern summary is required, which will be as viable as the Emerald Table and as the major arcana of the tarot. Right? And I believe what he's talking about here is sophiology. And however that is articulated. I've written some on it, but other people have written on it. But most people write it, when they do write in an academic way and not in an experiential, practical way. But I think that's what he's talking about, because when he says here, he says it may the essence of modern wisdom. And he emphasizes that in Sophia. Wisdom is Sophia. I mean, that's what the word means. Be saved in a spiritual Noah's Ark from the deluge which is going to come. Now, what is the deluge that he was seeing on its way? I would suggest that, what we've seen with the rise of, artificial intelligence, artificial biology, with the technological the way technology has overwhelmed our beings. I think this is part of what he's talking about. And the other things that attend that, right? It's not just the technology, it's the way how we change our approach to the real world, or how it evaporates, or it becomes decreased, and how we don't know what the real is anymore. We've talked about this already. And I think sophiology is an acknowledgement of what is real. It is being present to it as it shines through nature, which is a redemption of both nature and the human person, right? It's because we're participating in the wisdom of God. And I think that's why I wrote at the end of the submerged reality, this way leads to freedom. Because I think perhaps what Tomberg was talking about, he was seeing the kind of slavery and hostility in which our world is embroiled right now. And more, there's more to it than that, but that might be enough. And to finish, this is his last paragraph. I'll read that and that'll be it. This is the message of the woman kneeling under the stars on the bank of the current, which flows from the past into the future. A woman who never ceases to pour water from above into the flow of water below. It is she who is the mother of the future. And this is why her message confronts us with duty towards the future. The duty towards the flow of uninterrupted tradition. Let us therefore try to comply with this. I'll see you next time.